With Russia, and we'll get to Syria this way, we don't need to even get into the minutia of all of these various different intelligence reports and contesting of that. I think it's obvious that Russia had a preference and they preferred Trump, and there is some type of connection there because you don't need to go to intelligence reports to know that, Paul Manafort is connected to Russia, right? And he managed Trump's campaign. That's right there. That's it. Okay, we know these things. But we also know that Russia, as an instrument of foreign policy, is quite cozy with the European far right. And the European far right is not dismantling or committed to destroying the EU because they're upset about austerity and lack of social justice and too much power for corporations. They're upset about immigration. They're upset about multiculturalism. Now that takes us to Syria, because the paradox here is that the support of the Assad regime is the support of another, far-right reactionary government. There's no secret anti-imperialist sauce here. And I guess, maybe you could take us backwards a little bit through introducing Russia's role into Syria and the fact that now we've already been sort of cooperating with them, what it's going to look like under Trump. But, in the process of getting there, I think there's a lot of myths that have unfortunately been sort of seeding up on the left about the U.S. and Russian roles in Syria, which aren't just in and of themselves wrong-headed. They might lead to a sympathy for the type of foreign policy brutality we're talking about, and related to that, indirectly, a problematic response to the refugee crisis as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your point about Russia's interests and Russia's relationships in Europe is very well taken, because it's known that Russia bankrolls a lot of far-right parties in Europe. They bankrolled, it's known that they funded or helped fund the Front National in France.
Yep.
So they have a very pronounced goal in breaking up the post-war European order. And I think that it's very important when you're looking at that order to acknowledge its failings and acknowledge the areas where it very drastically needs to be improved. But there are very real, tangible reasons why it was created in the first place, and things which it has accomplished in the last 70 years. The reason that Trump makes a very point, which I think maybe people on the left and the right tend to see as making sense, that, NATO is an antiquated institution, and many of these we have relationships with these countries. They're holdovers from the end of World War II. What's the purpose of it? We should be focusing on the real threat to us, which is terrorism. Mm-hmm. Interstate warfare, which these institutions are supposed to prevent, is no longer a salient factor in our political lives. We need to focus on these networks of terrorists. But the thing is, the reason interstate warfare is no longer a threat to our lives is because we created these institutions to stop them. In Europe, the norm for pretty much all of European history up till the last 70, 80 years was interstate warfare. And now, miraculously, we have this sort of system which prevents it. And in doing so, it knitted all the countries of Europe together into the supranational entity, which is the manifestation of the EU. Now, the Front National and all these far-right parties and Russia, they want to see a reemergence of nationalism in Europe. Now, that's anyone with knowledge of European history knows that it's not a comforting sort of phenomena if that were to come about. So I think that it's very short-sighted, and I think that it's very easy to take a polemical view of history and just want to blow the thing up, but I don't think that that is the measured approach to be taken. And I think that people, especially on the left, they find it uncomfortable or sort of curious that they're agreeing with the Pat Buchanans or even the David Dukes of the world on certain foreign policy issues, because I think actually the right-wing people have a more clear idea of what's going on here and what the goals are.
Right.
The left are just taking the view that they're anti-establishment, but they don't have a positive vision for what replaces that establishment. They're just fellow travelers in a very troubling and scary project.
Right. If America's involved or there's a criticism of the United States, that's all I need to know and I can form an analysis, versus the reality that the United States is a problem, Russia's a problem, there's many different variables. So use Syria as a case study of where we've gotten. And I think, work it backwards from the beginning of U.S. engagement in Syria to Russia's engagement and how we've come to the policy we're at now. And now we're at the sort of verge of what you say has kind of been informally happening in the last couple of years, might be about to sort of more overtly happen after Trump, which is a alliance with Assad. And, in the process, explain why, Assad isn't this sort of, misunderstood anti-imperialist, or this is all about some secret pipeline deal, or, all these other things or that the only opposition to him is ISIS or Al-Qaeda. These are the myths that sort of seed on right and left. You can debunk those in the process of explaining how we got here.
Yeah. So it's a very messy and tragic case, what happened in Syria. In 2011, on the wave of the Arab Spring, there were huge, unprecedented demonstrations in Syria, not calling for the removal of the government, but calling for reform, basic reforms, which had not been enacted in 42 years of rule by one family over an entire country. It's not a socialist or in any way progressive regime, despite the fact that they use that terminology and that language to frame themselves in a very hollow manner. It's a family dynasty, it's a monarchy, a republican monarchy, basically, that has been created in that country. And instead of responding to the protests with agreements to impose incremental reforms, they use brute violence to try to snuff it out. Many very inspiring and heroic individuals, anarchists, leftists, revolutionaries, were treated most brutally by the Assad government. They were tortured to death in their prison chambers over the last several years. They disappeared off the face of the earth. They were killed, driven into exile. And the Assad regime sent a very strong message and they say it in their own slogans, very openly, that we're going to rule the country forever. And our only goal is forever, forever. And that's our ideology: absolute power, indefinitely, with no recourse. Assad is not, I think there's a great confusion among some people. He's not Fidel Castro or any of the left-wing revolutionary leaders who employed violence as a means of achieving a certain social project. There's no social project here besides absolute power and the manipulation of divisions within society to maintain that power, setting people against each other, even at the expense of great human catastrophes and degradation, just so we can maintain on top by any means necessary.
Would you say, just as a brief summary, that we could explain the Assad regime as clan power and reward system with a fascistic security structure centered around actually a version of sort of neoliberal economics?
That's an absolutely very good description, because as you mentioned very well at the end too, they're not socialists in a sense. They're absolute neoliberals to the nth degree, committed to, and they also have taken part in the United States war on terror. They were a very fulsome member of the rendition program.
Right.
There's nothing at all anti-imperial about them. They've always sought a very prominent role for themselves in the imperial game in the Middle East, and they've always sought to cozy up to the American president whenever it's possible, including Donald Trump. Bashar al-Assad has been very vocal about the fact that he sees Trump as a partner, because Trump is not someone who cares about human rights or cares about any liberal or progressive ideals. He's someone who's interested in having borders closed up and come what may in other countries. It's not his problem. And I think that this, again, is where you see this very troubling and sort of thoughtless convergence between right and left, because there are two ways you can look at Assad. You can look at him, two wrong ways of looking at him. You can look at him as an anti-imperialist hero, which I think that's very clear upon further analysis he's not. Or you can look at it in the sense that, I just don't care about what goes on in other countries, and the important thing to me is American policy, because I'm an American, and my number one concern is just not to be involved. And the thing is, this is a view which is not distinguishable in any way from the view of Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan also says, I'm just not interested in the world, and whatever's going on in Syria, good or bad, I just don't want to, America has nothing to do with it. We should stay out of it. And in a way, it's understandable, and it's way it's preferable to trying to do harm. The thing is, traditionally, leftists have had a international humanitarian vision,
Right,
and it's
right.
not to say that we're going to command the U.S. Army to intervene. We should not look at things in terms of states and factions. Our traditions look at things in terms of people and movements. So there are Syrian leftists and anarchists and revolutionaries who have who live this experience of the past several years. They have a project against the Assad regime and a very fulsome critique of the Assad regime and their own program for what they want to accomplish in Syria. And when you reduce everything down to what's Russia doing, what's the U.S. doing, what's the Syrian government doing, what's Turkey doing, they get obliterated in that narrative.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Over. Subscribe.